The alien queen locked the room and whispered, "You'll remain here tonight, human." He had fixed worse things in worse places. That was what Declan Howe told himself when the shuttle door sealed behind him, and the landing bay of the Vreth Dominion flagship Sovereign Meridian turned out to be roughly the size of a cathedral and considerably more hostile. The walls were not walls in any human sense. They were layered resonance panels, deep violet black, humming at a frequency that sat just below hearing and settled instead in the back teeth. The deck was polished obsidian composite that reflected his own boots back at him in distorted multiples, so that he appeared to arrive as a small crowd. The Vreth Honor Guard, 6 of them, 2 meters each, in articulated armor that looked grown rather than built, stood in a perfect arc and regarded him with the particular stillness of beings deciding whether he was relevant. He had one toolkit, one duffel, and a work order that the UEA Transit Authority had stamped 3 times in 3 colors to indicate it was serious. Repair detail. Requested by Office of the Vreth Dominion Queen Sovereign. Duration not to exceed 7 planetary rotations. Specialist grade, primary drive calibration, resonance coupling, subluminal array. Human, Declan Howe, 14 years certified. Declan had been many things in 14 years. He had crawled inside the exhaust housing of a freighter on a station that was venting atmosphere. He had repaired a jump array mid-transit because the engineer had miscounted the coupling pins, and the ship had needed someone small enough to reach the housing and unafraid enough to do it at speed. He had spent 31 hours inside a Keth mining platform's cooling shafts, because no one else on the crew had the certifications and the bonus had been significant. He had never been requested by name to a warship belonging to a civilization that had, until approximately 14 months ago, considered humanity an unverified rumor. He had read the initial contact reports the way everyone in the outer sectors had read them, on a work break, on a transit station, over bad coffee, and had found them interesting in the way that a well-written technical problem was interesting. Humanity had been going to the stars for long enough that first contact was a procedure rather than a concept. The Vreth were simply the newest entry in a list that kept getting longer. What had stood out to him was a single paragraph buried in the 3rd summary bulletin, a note from a human liaison officer. The Vreth seemed particularly interested in our mechanical infrastructure. They asked more questions about our drive arrays than about our governments. Declan had marked that paragraph and thought, well, good, drive arrays I understand. The largest of the honor guard stepped forward. The armor read him in a sweep of amber light, top to bottom, and then the guard spoke in Vreth, a language that sounded like several instruments playing simultaneously and not quite agreeing, and the suit's translator chip buried in Declan's collar processed it into flat, serviceable standard. The specialist is expected. The specialist will follow. Declan picked up his duffel and followed. The asterisk Sovereign Meridian was a masterpiece of engineering, and Declan was professionally furious about it. He could see it in everything. The way the resonance panels distributed load without conventional structural ribs, the way the heat exchange systems ran through the walls rather than beneath the floors, the elegant economy of systems that did 12 things with the footprint of 1. Whoever had designed this ship had understood that mass was the enemy of speed, and had spent generations solving it in ways that human engineers were still arguing about in journals. The corridors were not wasted space. They were structural components, the geometry of their cross-sections contributing to the ship's overall resonance signature in a way that would have taken a human design team several additional centuries to arrive at independently. He walked through 3 of those corridors on the way to his quarters and calculated the angles of the ceiling joins and thought, someone very clever worked on this problem for a very long time. His quarters were small, efficient, and calibrated for a Vreth body, which meant the bunk was slightly too long and the gravity was slightly too high, and he spent his first night feeling as though someone had placed a moderate amount of water on top of him. He made a note in his work log: request gravity recalibration. He decided to do it after he'd looked at the actual problem, because priority sequencing mattered. And the actual problem was this: the resonance coupling arrays in the primary drive bay were drifting. He heard it before his escort brought him to the drive bay. He heard it in the corridors, in the structural resonance of the walls, a faint and irregular stutter in the ship's otherwise consistent hum, a syncopation, one element of a chord slightly flat, the kind of thing that took 14 years to hear. He did not say anything about it yet. He catalogued it. The drive bay was a vast, low-ceilinged space packed with what the Vreth called resonance coupling arrays, the precise mechanical and energetic equivalent of what human engineers would have called primary drive couplings if they had designed them from a completely different starting philosophy. They were taller than anything in the human equivalent, and arranged in a radial pattern rather than the linear banks that human ships used. And they were beautiful in the way that very functional things could be beautiful, and they were drifting. The Vreth engineer assigned to assist him was named something elaborate and introduced himself as Rake for Declan's convenience. Rake was tall, gray-scaled, meticulous in the way that good engineers were meticulous, not because they were anxious, but because they understood that small errors propagated into large ones and preferred to prevent that. And he was deeply skeptical of Declan, which Declan found entirely reasonable. "You can hear it," Rake said. "This was not a compliment, it was a test." "Third coupling array from the aft bulkhead," Declan said. "The resonance bridge is fragmenting at load. My guess is the calibration pins have drifted, thermal expansion over long-distance transit maybe, or a manufacturing variance that only shows up under sustained load." He paused. "My guess is thermal. The third array is the one that would see the most variation in heat exposure given the radial layout and the ship's standard transit orientation." Rake's jaw did a complicated thing that the translator chip declined to interpret. "The specialist's guess is correct. The cause is thermal drift. We identified the primary array 12 days ago." "But not the others." A pause. "The others are within tolerance." Declan looked at the arrays. He looked at the geometry of the radial layout and thought through the heat flow and the way the variance would propagate through the calibration pins under sustained load, and he counted the arrays and he said, "They won't be within tolerance in 40 days. Maybe 30 if you're running hard transit." He looked at Rake. "Can I get access to the housing? All of them, not just the third." Rake's jaw did the thing again. "The specialist will have access." He got access. He spent 6 hours inside the housing on the first day, not fixing anything, just mapping, running diagnostics, recording the variant signature of each of the 7 coupling arrays, building a picture of the full scope of the problem rather than reaching for the obvious answer. This was the thing that made the difference between a repair and a solution. You had to know how much was actually wrong before you could know what right was going to look like. He ate the meal that a junior crew member brought him without looking up from his diagnostic slate. The meal was utilitarian, and he consumed it with the focus of someone running on fuel, not appetite. He slept the gravity-heavy sleep of his slightly underwater quarters, and he went back to the drive bay in the morning. On the third day, someone came to watch. He noticed her because the honor guard noticed her, a shift in their posture, a particular quality of attention that was different from the constant ambient alertness they maintained in his presence. It was the shift of people who had been standing at attention and had now, without moving, become still. The distinction was subtle, and Declan had spent 14 years in spaces where people's posture told you important things about what was happening near them. He was elbow-deep in the calibration housing and did not turn around. "The diagnostic is running a resonance sweep," he said. "If you want to watch, you're welcome to, but the bay will hum at a fairly unpleasant frequency for about 4 minutes. Forewarned." Silence. The 4 minutes ran. The diagnostic completed. He pulled the reader, looked at the results, noted 3 things, and then, because he was curious rather than careless, he turned around. She was taller than Rake. Taller than most of the crew he had seen, which already put them at a considerable altitude relative to him. Her scales were the deep blue-violet that he had learned to associate with the Vreth upper caste, almost the color of the ship's walls, as though the aesthetic of the asterisk sovereign meridian had been built backward from the people it was meant to carry. Her eyes were gold, fully gold, no pupil separation that he could identify, and they were fixed on him with an expression he couldn't read yet but was working on. The insignia she wore was something he hadn't seen on anyone else on the ship. Complex, layered, the kind of marking that meant something specific in a system he didn't know yet. He didn't need the translator to tell him what the broad category of it was. The way the honor guard was standing told him that. The way Rake, across the bay, had gone very carefully still told him that. "I didn't realize I was getting an inspection," Declan said. He kept his voice even. He had been inspected by supervisors, by clients, by transit authority representatives, and once by a Keth station commander who had very strong opinions about safety protocols, and he had learned that even-voiced was the correct register for all of them. "Queen Sovereign. I'd offer a proper introduction, but I've got calibration compound on both hands." The translator in his collar took a moment. The language processing was good. The UEA had invested heavily in Vreth translation over the 14 months since contact, but formal Vreth had complexities that the colloquial version didn't, and her register was formal. "We are aware. We came to observe the work, not to receive ceremony." Her standard, even translated, was the plural authority form, the royal asterisk we asterisk, which the briefing documents had flagged as the Queen Sovereign's default register in any official or semi-official context. But her voice was something else, lower than he'd expected. A controlled instrument, precise and deliberate, like the ship's hum but with intention behind it. "How long have you been aware of the problem?" she asked. "I identified the primary variants on day 1. I've spent 2 days mapping the full spread because I wanted to make sure I wasn't fixing the symptom and leaving the cause." He picked up the diagnostic reader and angled it toward her without quite extending it, an offer of information rather than a presentation. "The calibration pins have drifted in 3 of the 7 coupling arrays. The 3rd one is the loudest, but it's not the worst. If I'd corrected only the 3rd array, the 2nd and 5th would have become audible within 40 days. The 2nd is already closer to the margin than your engineers have calculated." She looked at the reader. She looked at the data on it with a focus that was not performative. She was actually looking, actually trying to read it, even though the notation system was human standard and the Vreth equivalents were different. "Rake told us you could hear it before he showed you the specifications." 14 years, Declan said. "You hear the difference between the way a properly calibrated array hums and the way a drifting one hums. It's not magic. It's a lot of time in engine rooms. The Vreth engineers on this vessel have a combined service of over 200 years, the Queen Sovereign said. None of them heard it as a problem." "They heard it," Declan said. "They heard it and they ran the calculations, and the calculations said it was within tolerance. They weren't wrong about the calculations. They just didn't hear what the calculations were going to look like in 30 days. He paused. "Also, respectfully, the tolerance parameters your engineers are using were written for a different transit profile than the sovereign meridian has been running over the last 2 years. The margin is narrower than the baseline assumes." Silence. She was looking at him the way someone looked at something they had not expected to find where they found it. "We will speak with Rake about the tolerance parameters," she said. "I've already flagged it in my diagnostic notes. I'll include the revised profile in the completion report." She looked at the coupling housing. She looked at the diagnostic reader. Then she looked at him with the expression he couldn't fully read yet, but was starting to have a hypothesis about. "We will return tomorrow," she said. Then she turned and left, and the honor guard moved with her like a tide going out, and the bay settled back into its working silence. Rake appeared at Declan's elbow. "That was the Queen Sovereign," Rake said. "This was technically unnecessary." "I gathered," Declan said. He looked back at the diagnostic reader. "Is there a protocol I violated?" "No." Rake's jaw did the complicated thing. Declan was beginning to believe this was the Vreth equivalent of a suppressed reaction, the involuntary tick of someone who had something to say and was deciding not to say it. "You spoke to her as though she were an engineer." "She asked me engineering questions." "Yes," Rake said slowly, with the weight of someone arriving at a conclusion they hadn't expected. "She did. She came back the next day, and the day after that. She came back without the full honor guard, 2 attendants only, stationed near the bay entrance. She moved through the working space without the formal register of a state visit, and Declan, who was running the correction sequence on the 4th coupling array, noted the difference without commenting on it. People who were performing a role moved differently than people who were present. She had arrived the first day performing the role Queen Sovereign of the Vreth Dominion, conducting a formal review of contract work, every line of her posture and every syllable of her register carrying the weight of what she was. The second and third days, something had shifted. He couldn't have named it precisely. It was in the way she moved through the bay, less like someone walking through a space that belonged to her, and more like someone returning to a place they had been before and were glad to find unchanged. It was in the way she asked questions, not the kind that established understanding, but the kind that were actually curious. There was a difference. He had been asked questions by inspection boards and transit authority oversight officials and clients who wanted to know if their money was being well spent, and he had been asked questions by Rake, who genuinely wanted to understand the work. She asked the way Rake did, without agenda, just interested in the answer. He filed this under * notable and kept working. "The hum is different today," she said on the 3rd visit. "The first 3 arrays are corrected. The 4th is in progress. The difference you're hearing is the gap between the corrected signature and the remaining drift." He glanced at her. "You can hear the difference." "I grew up on this ship," she said. "I have heard it my entire life." "Then you knew something was wrong before I arrived." A pause. A pause that lasted long enough to mean something. "I knew the engineers had declared it within tolerance. But," she did not say *, but she did not have to. Declan finished the sequence and pulled back from the housing. He wiped the calibration compound from his hands on a work cloth and turned to face her properly. She was closer than he had expected. She had moved while he was working, the way someone did when they were actually interested rather than performing interest, closing the distance by increments without announcing it. "The 7th array," he said, "the one I haven't gotten to yet, worse or better than the others from where you're standing." She was quiet for a moment that felt like a decision being made. "Worse," she said. Declan nodded. "I'll need an extra day." "Then you will have it." He looked at her. She was looking at the housing with an expression he was starting to be able to read, not the formal gold-eyed assessment she had used the first day, but something that sat closer to the surface. Something that was actually there rather than being the registered response to a situation. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You may ask." The maintenance request came through 3 different transit authority offices and took 11 weeks to process. You could have sent for a Vreth engineer. There are certified drive specialists in the outer sectors who do this work, and the Vreth Dominion has agreements with 4 of the major independent stations. Why did you specifically request a human tech? And why by name? She turned her head and looked at him directly, and the gold of her eyes caught the bay's working lights and held them. "We had read the reports on human engineers," she said. "Specifically, The reports compiled during the treaty negotiations, assessments of human technical personnel who had worked on or alongside VRETH systems. There was one report that described a human specialist who continued working on a coupling array during a hull integrity alarm because he had determined the coupling failure was the more immediate risk. Declan said nothing. He had a fairly specific memory of that incident. "That was you," she said. "The alarm was rated for a section 2 decks up from where I was working. I checked the breach geometry before I decided to stay. The coupling failure would have cascaded in 12 minutes. The hull breach could wait 20, and the section in question had its emergency seals intact." He paused. "It wasn't reckless, it was sequencing." The report noted that you did not ask for permission to make that determination. There wasn't time to ask for permission and also fix the coupling in the 12 minutes available. I chose the coupling. She held his gaze for a moment that had a quality of measurement in it, but not the cold kind of measurement, the kind that was interested in what it was finding. "We wanted someone who understood which problem to solve first," she said, "and was willing to solve it without waiting for someone else to agree." Declan looked at the coupling arrays. He looked at the work he still had to do, then he looked at her. "What's the real problem?" he said. "Not with the ship, with the situation. The one that made 11 weeks of transit authority paperwork worth it." The two attendants near the bay entrance did not move, but their quality of stillness changed, a shift he wouldn't have caught if he hadn't been paying attention. "Why does the specialist assume there is another problem?" she said, and her voice had gone back to the formal register, the royal asterisk we asterisk returning, the distance re-establishing itself. "Because you grew up on this ship," Declan said, keeping his voice level and factual rather than challenging. "You can hear the arrays. You knew something was wrong before your engineers told you it was within tolerance. And you waited 11 weeks for a human tech from outside any of your existing maintenance agreements, rather than sending for someone closer, which means you wanted a specific quality, someone who sequences correctly under pressure, who doesn't wait for permission to solve the right problem first." He paused. "I think the coupling arrays are real. I think there's also something else." The silence that followed was very long. "There is a summit," she said finally. Her voice was quieter now, and the royal register had thinned at the edges, like ice at the boundary where it met something warmer. 11 days from now, 3 Dominion houses will be aboard this ship simultaneously. The asterisk sovereign Meridian asterisk is the neutral vessel for the meeting. It is a matter of deep protocol that the summit host ship must be beyond reproach in its operational condition. A flagship that sounds wrong is a flagship that looks weak. If this ship shows any instability during the summit, the political consequences would not be recoverable. And you didn't want to ask one of the other houses for a drive specialist, because that would signal that your own people couldn't handle it. Correct. And requesting help from within any Dominion-aligned station creates a record that the other houses have access to. Also correct. So you went outside the Dominion system entirely. A human contractor, on a human transit authority work order, appearing in a record that none of the other houses are monitoring. Yes. That's actually a very elegant solution, Declan said. The corner of her mouth moved. He wasn't sure yet if that was the VRETH equivalent of what it looked like, but he filed it as a data point and continued watching. "We found it serviceable," she said. The 7th array was worse than the others. It was worse in an interesting way. The calibration drift was accompanied by a microfracture in the resonance bridging that had propagated slowly along a crystalline stress line, invisible to the standard sweep, but obvious once he ran the secondary harmonic diagnostic. Declan found it at hour 3 on his 5th day and sat back on his heels in the cramped housing and thought about it for a while. He ran the diagnostic twice more to confirm. He pulled the fracture mapping and looked at the propagation angle and calculated the timeline. He could fix it. The fix was more complex than the others. It required removing and reseating the bridge assembly, which was not a small job, and the resonance recalibration after would need to run in stages to avoid shocking the corrected arrays he'd already finished. The staging protocol would add time. Done wrong, it could stress the corrected arrays and undo days of work. Done right, it would leave the ship in better condition than it had been in for years, not just for the summit but permanently. He brought Rake in and showed him. Rake looked at the fracture mapping for a long time. His jaw did the complicated suppressed reaction thing. "We would not have found this," he said, "not defensive, honest." "You would have, eventually. The fracture would have become audible within 2 or 3 months. The standard sweep would have caught it at that point." "After the summit?" "Yes," Declan said, "after the summit." He looked at the mapping. "I want to show you the repair protocol before I start it. You should know how to do this in case the ship ever needs it again and I'm not available." Rake looked at him. Something shifted in his expression that might have been surprise. "You would show me. You're the drive engineer on this ship. You should know how your ship works." "That's not a complicated position." Declan tapped the mapping display. "Here's where we start." They worked 12 hours straight. The Queen Sovereign came at the 7th hour without announcement and stood at the bay entrance and watched. She didn't come inside the housing space. She stayed far enough back to be out of the way, which told Declan she understood engine work well enough to know that extra people in the housing were a problem, and she stayed for 2 hours. She watched without speaking. When she left, neither he nor Rake said anything about it, and the work continued. At the end of the shift, when Rake had gone and Declan was logging his work notes, an attendant appeared with food. Not the standard crew rations he'd been receiving, something that smelled significantly more complex and was served in tableware that was clearly not from the crew mess. He ate it. It was excellent. He made a note of this in his work log, under *miscellaneous*, because documentation was documentation. On the 6th day, with the 7th array half rebuilt, and the recalibration sequence designed and staged and ready to run, the Queen Sovereign arrived in the bay in the morning before the crew came in. She was, in the technical sense, alone. The attendants were at the entrance, as usual, but something was different about the way she moved through the space. The formal layers of the Queen Sovereign register had been set aside somewhere between the corridor and the bay door. She moved like the person who had grown up on this ship, who knew every corridor and the angle of every ceiling join, who had listened to the drive hum as a child, and learned from it something that did not have a name but was real. "We would like to understand the fracture propagation," she said, "if the specialist is willing to explain it." Declan looked at her. He noted the *, still formal, still holding the register, and then he said, "Sure," and gestured at the diagnostic reader. He spent an hour explaining the crystalline stress mechanics of a resonance bridge under sustained thermal load, what the fracture was, how it had propagated, why the standard sweep hadn't caught it, what the repair protocol addressed, and why the staging mattered. She asked questions. They were good questions, not the questions of an engineer, but the questions of someone who understood systems holistically, who could follow the logic of a complex interaction without knowing the specific vocabulary, who was interested in the *y as much as the what. At some point they were standing quite close together over the diagnostic reader, and he was pointing at the fracture mapping, and she was looking at it with the focused attention she brought to everything, and the bay around them was quiet except for the corrected hum of the first 6 arrays, which was close to what the ship was supposed to sound like. The 7th array's contribution was still missing, the small gap in the chord. "You talk about the ship as though it is," she started and stopped. "Alive," Declan said. "We were going to say coherent as though its sounds constitute a language that can be learned. They do, sort of. A machine tells you what it needs if you know how to listen. If you know what normal sounds like, you can hear when it's gone. The problem is being fluent enough to hear the right thing rather than just hearing noise. She was quiet. The bay hummed around them. We have spoken to many people about this ship over many years, she said slowly. Engineers, political advisors, crews who have served aboard it for decades. No one has described it in those terms. Most people describe machines as problems to solve, Declan said. I think of them as conversations. The machine is telling you something. The question is whether you're listening. She looked at him then, the full gold assessment, direct and level, and he was close enough now to notice that the gold wasn't uniform. There were striations in it, darker lines radiating from a center point, the structure of something that had grown rather than been set. Like the growth rings in very old material. He filed this. The summit is in 6 days, she said. I'll be done in 2. We know. She held the diagnostic reader for a moment without looking at it. Her focus was elsewhere. When the work is complete, what is the protocol for the departure? I pack up, sign off with Rake on the completion documentation, and take the shuttle back to the transit station. The UEA Transit Authority gets the completion report and issues the invoice through standard channels. And you go. That's generally how contract work functions. She set the diagnostic reader down carefully. She looked at the coupling arrays, all of them, the full radial span of them, the corrected 6 and the one still under repair. Then she looked at him. We have a question, she said. That is not about the ship. Declan waited. During your first visit, the first day, when we arrived in the bay, you said you could not offer a proper introduction because of the calibration compound. You did not apologize for it. You noted it as a practical fact and continued. It was a practical fact. 17 other people who have found themselves unexpectedly in our presence have noted practical facts and also apologized extensively for the failure of ceremony. The corner of her mouth moved. You did not. I wasn't failing ceremony. I was working. The work seemed more immediately important than the ceremony, given the reason I was here in the first place. Yes, she said, a pause. We found that clarifying. He understood that he was being told something. He was not entirely certain yet of all of it, but he was a person who had learned to listen to the thing underneath the thing that was being said, and he could hear it. This is going to be an odd question, he said, keeping his voice even. And tell me if it's overstepping. I'm aware of approximately 15 ways that might be true. But is there something you want to say that the formal register makes it harder to say? The attendants near the entrance held their positions. The bay hum ran clean and steady in the corrected sections. Yes, she said. Her voice was still even, still controlled, and underneath the control there was the effort of control, the quality of someone holding something carefully because they had not decided yet whether to set it down. We believe there may be. Would it be easier without the audience? She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned slightly toward the entrance and said something in breath, quick and quiet, the singular form, not a command but a request, which Declan couldn't know from the words but could read in the way the attendants moved. They withdrew past the threshold without ceremony. She looked back at him. The bay was very quiet. The corrected 6 arrays hummed. I have been Queen Sovereign for 8 years, she said. The we was gone. Just like that, set down, the way a formal garment might be set aside when no one required it. The singular fell into the space it had left and it fit. Before that, I was the heir for 11 years before that. I have been on this ship since I was a child. I know every part of it. I know the drive bay, I know the sound of each array, or I knew it until they began to drift. I heard them drift. I heard something that was not right, and I was told they were within tolerance. A pause. I am not an engineer. I could hear that something was wrong, but I could not name it precisely enough to make anyone act. That's not a failure, Declan said. You heard the right thing. The problem was the vocabulary, not the listening. Yes, she breathed out slowly. But it was a particular experience to hear something and be unable to articulate it to the people responsible for it in terms they would credit, and then to hear you articulate it in the first hour, before Rake showed you a single specification. She looked at him steadily. I have been watching you work for several days because I find the experience of watching someone who understands what they are listening to unusual. I am not in the habit of finding things unusual. Declan was quiet for a moment. He said, I'm going to commit to the interpretation that that's a compliment. Her mouth moved, and this time there was no ambiguity about it, not a Vreth smile equivalent, a smile. He was now certain of that. It is, she said. He looked at the seventh array. He looked at the work still ahead of him. He looked at her. What's your name? He said. The name that isn't Queen Sovereign. She held his gaze. Sarath, she said. Declan, he said. She nodded once, not formal, not ceremonial, just the acknowledgement of one person to another. I know, she said. He finished the seventh array on day 7. The recalibration sequence ran for 4 hours, and he monitored every stage of it, sitting on the deck near the housing with the diagnostic reader and a cup of something hot that Rake had produced from somewhere. And Rake sat across from him, and they watched the readings settle stage by stage. The first stage, the fracture region stabilizing, the bridge assembly seating into the corrected position, the harmonic readings moving from the jagged signature of a stressed component into the smooth line of something that had found its proper configuration. The second stage, the broader array coming online, the resonance pins recalibrating, the signature of the seventh array beginning to match the signature of the corrected 6, not identical, because each array had its own character and that was fine, but harmonically coherent with them, part of the same chord. The third stage, the full integration sweep, all 7 arrays running together, the drive bay's overall signature resolving into what it was supposed to be. When the sequence completed, the drive bay was quiet. Not the within tolerance quiet of the last however long, the quiet that was actually a form of managed noise, a held position just inside the acceptable range. The quiet that settled now was different. It was the settled quiet of systems running correctly, the hum of something that had found its correct frequency, and was simply running there, without effort, without the faint stutter and syncopation that had been absent long enough that Declan had almost forgotten what the ship sounded like without it. He listened. He closed his eyes and listened to all 7 arrays together. Rake listened beside him. His jaw did the complicated thing, and this time the read was clear, suppressed relief. The relief of someone who had known something was wrong and hadn't been able to name it, and was now hearing it named through the absence of the wrongness. Full load test to confirm, Declan said, not opening his eyes yet. Run the drive at 70% for 6 hours and pull the diagnostic readings after. I'll leave you the correction parameters and the staging protocol, so if anything shifts in the next maintenance cycle, your engineers will know exactly what to look for and exactly what to do about it. They will know to listen, Rake said. Yes, Declan opened his eyes. They'll know what to listen for. He started to close out his work log. The completion report was going to be thorough. He always wrote thorough reports, because the next person who touched this work should be able to understand it without having been there. He was organizing the structure of it when the bay door opened. She came in alone, no attendants at the entrance, the door sealed behind her. Declan noted this. He was a person who noted things. The array is corrected, she said. Her voice was even, but there was something underneath it that wasn't. All 7. The recalibration sequence completed 40 minutes ago. The signature is clean. He tilted his head. You can hear it. She stopped. She stood in the entrance of the bay and she listened, and something crossed her face that was not the formal register and not the Queen Sovereign assessment, but something older and simpler than either of them. The expression of a person who had been waiting, without admitting the waiting, for a sound to come back, and was hearing it. "Yes," she said quietly. Rake gathered his tools with the efficiency of someone who had suddenly found somewhere else to be, and the bay door closed behind him, and the space held only the two of them and the corrected hum of 7 properly calibrated arrays running together for the first time in a long time. Declan stood up. He brushed the deck residue from his work trousers. He looked at his diagnostic reader and thought about the completion report. "I'll have the documentation to your systems by morning. The Transit Authority will process the completion notice and—" "Declan." He stopped. It was the first time she had used his name, not the specialist asterisk, not human asterisk. His name, in her voice, which was not the formal voice, which was something underneath all the voices she had available to her, the one she had let him hear in pieces over 7 days in a drive bay on a ship she had grown up on. He looked at her. She crossed the bay toward him and stopped when she was close. The distance they'd been standing at over the diagnostic reader, over the fracture mapping, in the observation room she hadn't taken him to yet but would, the same distance that had been established across 7 days and had not been incidental. "The summit is in 5 days," she said. "There will be 3 houses aboard this ship and the full weight of Dominion protocol for all of it. I will be required to be the Queen Sovereign through every hour of it." A pause. "Your contract ends tomorrow morning." "Yes." "I am aware," she said, and her voice was careful in the way it was careful when she was holding something with both hands, "that what I am going to say is outside what is standard." "I'm listening." "I would like you to remain on this ship for the duration of the summit." She held his gaze. The gold of her eyes was steady. "Not as a contractor, not in any official capacity. I would like you to remain because the ship sounds correct again, and I find that I am not ready, having heard what correct sounds like, to navigate the next 5 days without the person who made it sound that way." Declan was quiet. "This is not a request I would normally make," she said. "I know. You are not obligated. Also know that." She said slowly, "I am not asking as Queen Sovereign. I am asking as—" she paused. "As the person who watched you work for 7 days and found that someone who listens to machines the way you do is unusual," Declan said. The smile, full, unambiguous, not formal. "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the bay, the clean lines of the corrected arrays, the ship humming right, 7 days of work that had been more interesting than any 7 days he'd had in a while. He looked at her. "I'll need to renegotiate the contract terms," he said. She breathed in, and in the breath there was something that was not very formal at all. "Rake will handle it. I'll also need someone to adjust the gravity calibration in my quarters. I've been sleeping slightly underwater for a week." The smile again. "That will be corrected by morning." "Then I'll stay," Declan said. The summit arrived, and it was everything promised. 3 house flags in the landing bay, formal honor guards in conflicting insignia, the elaborate choreography of a gathering that had centuries of protocol behind it and did not intend to let anyone forget. The asterisk sovereign Meridian received the delegations with the full weight of its status as neutral ground, and Sarath became the Queen Sovereign completely for every formal session, wearing the full regalia and the formal register, and the measured distance of someone managing not a conversation but a system. Declan stayed out of it. He was not a diplomat and had no brief to be won. He checked the drive arrays in the morning. Once, systematically, the way you check something you had repaired and wanted to verify remained repaired, and they were clean every day. He logged the readings. He helped Rake interpret the full load test results, which confirmed everything the recalibration had promised. On the 3rd evening of the summit, he ate dinner in a small observation room off a secondary corridor. Not the main corridors that the summit used, but the quieter ones that the working crew moved through, the ship's own circulatory system, rather than the routes set aside for diplomacy. The room was small enough to be comfortable and had an observation port that faced the binary system they were holding position in. Outside it, both stars, old amber, orbiting each other at a distance measured in astronomical units, cast doubled light across the port glass and the quiet space inside. He had tea from the crew mess and his work log, and the particular piece of someone who had finished a difficult thing, and was comfortable sitting inside the fact of its completion. He had checked the arrays that morning. Clean. All 7. The summit had been going for 3 days and the ship had run correctly through all of it, and no one in any of the delegations had any reason to know that 8 days ago they would have been hearing something wrong. He was reading his own notes on the staging protocol. He was going to write a technical paper on the repair method. He had decided. It was novel enough to be worth documenting properly, and the Vreth crystalline resonance bridge architecture was not well documented in human engineering literature, when he heard the door open. He did not turn around, because he had heard her footsteps enough times in the drive bay over 7 days that he knew them without needing to look. She sat across the small table. She had removed the formal regalia, the heavy symbolic layers, and was in the ship's everyday uniform, deep blue-violet, clean lines, without insignia. In this light she looked like the person who had grown up on the ship, someone who had been carrying something for a long time and had recently found, in a drive bay with a human engineer and 7 coupling arrays, a place to briefly put it down. The evening session concluded well, she said. Good. The delegation from the second house agreed to the transit compact. The language took 4 sessions to settle, but the core terms held. She looked at the binary stars. The ship sounded correct through all of it. It will keep sounding correct, Declan said. Run the maintenance schedule. Rake has it. He has memorized it. She was quiet for a moment, watching the doubled amber light shift slowly across the port as the ship held its position. You will leave when the summit ends. That's the plan, unless the 7th array decides to develop additional opinions. She looked at him. The formal register was entirely absent. What was in its place was something that had been there since the 3rd day in the drive bay, when she had started asking questions about resonance bridges and found, apparently, that someone was answering them in a way that was unusual. I have been the Queen Sovereign for 8 years, she said. In that time I have met heads of state, ambassadors, treaty architects, and military commanders from 17 civilizations. I have been in rooms where the stakes of every sentence were measured in lives and territory and the trajectory of civilizations. She looked at him across the small table. I have had one conversation in those 8 years that I did not know how to prepare for in advance. Declan looked at her across the table. Outside, the binary stars, both old and amber and unhurried, cast their doubled light across the planes of her face, and the striations in her gold eyes caught the light and held it. The one in a drive bay, he said, with calibration compound on both hands. Yes, she said, that one. On the night before the last day of the summit, she came to the observation room again without announcement. They sat with the tea going cold on the table because neither of them was paying attention to it, talking about the summit and what it actually meant beneath the formal language of the compact, and about the ship, and about what she had heard in the hum the morning after she'd been told the problem was within tolerance, the specific quality of knowing something and not being able to make anyone else hear it. My engineers are good engineers, she said. They were not wrong to declare it within tolerance. I was, a pause. You were listening for something they weren't listening for, Declan said. You just didn't have the name for it. Yes, she looked at the binary stars. I have been doing that my whole life, listening for something and not having the precise name for it. In the drive bay, in council meetings, in the long work of 8 years managing a civilization, a pause, and in smaller things. Declan turned his cup in his hands. He looked at her profile against the doubled amber light and thought about 14 years in engine rooms, and the things you learned if you stayed in them long enough, and the things that didn't come from engine rooms at all. "I leave in the morning," he said. "Yes. I'd like to come back." She turned from the stars and looked at him, and the formal register was entirely absent, and what was in its place was something that had been close to named for several days. "On what terms?" she said. "Not as a contractor," Declan said, "just to come back." A long quiet. The binary stars shifted their doubled light as the ship turned very slowly in its holding position, the way a ship did when everything was running as it should. "There is a corridor on this ship," Sarath said, "where the resonance panels carry the drive hum most clearly. When I was a child, I used to go there to listen to the ship sound correct. The tone was different from every other part of the ship, fuller, cleaner. I believed for a long time that it was special about the corridor." She paused. "I understand now it was the positioning relative to the arrays, the acoustics. It was not magic." "But you still went there." "I went there because it sounded correct, and I could not always hear that from everywhere else on the ship." She looked at him. "I have not been there in some years." The drift made it something other than what it was. "And now?" "Now," she said, "it sounds correct again." He looked at her, she looked at him. Outside, the old amber stars did their unhurried work. "I'll be back," Declan said. 8 months for the maintenance review." 8 months, she said, "is not very long." "No," he said, "it isn't." He was packing his toolkit on the morning of departure when the attendant knocked and said the Queen Sovereign requested his presence before departure. The room she met him in was small and not formal, a working room off the main diplomatic corridor, a place for practical conversation rather than ceremony. She was in the everyday uniform. There were 2 cups of tea on the table. "I thought you might want something before the transit wait," she said. Not Queen Sovereign, just Sarath, who had grown up on this ship and knew where the small rooms were. "I would," Declan said. He sat across from her and they drank tea, and outside the observation port the binary stars were still there, both of them, unhurried amber, running their long slow orbit that had been going on long before this ship existed and would continue long after it was gone. She asked him how the transit authority handled completion paperwork, and he explained that it was mostly automated and then inexplicably terrible for about 3 weeks because someone in the Lion processing office always lost a stamp. She told him about the compact that the second house had signed, and why the specific wording had taken 4 sessions, and what it was actually going to mean for transit routes in the outer sectors, and which of the delegations had surprised her. They talked about the ship, the sound of it now, clean and correct through the summit, running at the frequency it was built to run at. She said that she had gone to the corridor on the 3rd night of the summit, the one where the resonance panels carried the drive hum most clearly. "How did it sound?" Declan said. "Correct," she said. He nodded. After a moment she said, "There is a maintenance review scheduled for the drive arrays in 8 months, not looking up from her tea. Standard cycle. The schedule Rake has memorized." "I wrote that schedule," Declan said. "The review would require a specialist with the appropriate certifications and the appropriate," she paused, "the appropriate listening. The specialist in question would need to check his calendar." "Of course. I suspect his calendar would be amenable." She looked up from her tea then, and the gold of her eyes in the doubled amber light held the striations and the warmth and the thing that was, now, fully named. "Good," she said. He was at the shuttle bay threshold, toolkit in hand, duffel over his shoulder, completion report filed, gravity in his quarters corrected 2 days too late to matter when she stopped him. "Not formally. Not with an attendant or a protocol or any of the apparatus of the Queen Sovereign of the Vreth Dominion. She simply came through the bay and said his name and he turned." She was alone. She had followed him to the shuttle bay herself, which he was entirely certain was not in any protocol document anywhere. She stopped close. The distance they had established across 7 days in a drive bay and 3 evenings in an observation room, and 1 morning with tea going cold, the distance that had been closing by increments without anyone announcing it. "Declan," she said. "Sarath," he said. She held his gaze. The gold eyes were direct, level, not the assessment, not the formal register, but the thing underneath all the registers. The thing that had been there since the 3rd day, when she had moved closer while he was working without announcing it. "The ship sounds correct," she said. "Yes." "It will sound correct at the maintenance review." "Yes." She said slowly, "I want it noted that this has been an unusual 10 days. "I'll put it in the report," Declan said. She stepped closer and lowered her voice to something that was not meant for the bay generally, not for the attendants outside the threshold, not for any protocol or register or the formal apparatus of anything, just for him. "The alien queen locked the room," she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper, and whispered, "You'll remain here tonight, human. The shuttle can wait 1 more day." She reached past him without breaking his gaze, and the door made a soft sound, the click of a secured lock, quiet and absolute, and the bay was just theirs. He looked at her. The ship hummed correctly around them. He set down the duffel. "The shuttle can wait," he said. He stayed. The formal record would note that the specialist's departure had been delayed by 1 day due to a final documentation review, which was not entirely untrue. Rake, when asked by the Transit Authority's processing office, confirmed that the specialist had been exceptionally thorough in his documentation, and that thoroughness sometimes required additional time. This was also not entirely untrue. What the record would not note was the observation room with the doubled amber stars, which saw them again that evening. The tea eventually warmed, the binary stars doing their unhurried work outside, 2 people in a small room on a ship that was running correctly for the first time in a long time. She talked about the summit, not the formal version, but the real version beneath it, the places where careful language had hidden arguments she had been navigating for years. She talked about growing up on the asterisk sovereign meridian and the specific sound of the corridor, where the resonance panels carried the drive hum most clearly, and what it had meant to go there as a child and hear the ship sound like itself, and what it had meant when that stopped being available. Declan talked about 14 years in engine rooms, the Keth cooling shafts and the jump array at transit speed, and the hull breach that could wait 20 minutes and the coupling that couldn't, and what you learned about listening when you spent enough time in spaces where the machines had things to say, and it was your job to hear them. At some point, the ship's night cycle lights had shifted to their low amber setting, and the formal distance between them had completed its long journey to wherever it had been going all along, and she had stopped mid-sentence and was looking at him. "What?" he said. "I was noting this," she said. The smallest gesture at the space between them, the table, the cups, the doubled light. "I want a record of it. The moment before the word for it existed." "I'll be back in 8 months, Declan said. "I know." She looked at the observation port and the stars beyond it. 8 months is not very long. "No," he said, "it isn't." She looked back at him, and the gold of her eyes was warm in the night cycle amber, and the thing in them had its name now. "Good," she said. He left the next morning. The transit bay saw him off with the minimum protocol. Rake was there, Jaw doing the complicated thing that Declan now read as warmth, and 2 attendants, and the clean mechanical sound of a ship running exactly as it should. No ceremony. He had not expected ceremony and did not want it. The shuttle pulled away from the sovereign meridian, and he watched through the port as the ship receded, vast and clean-lined and correct in all its systems, running at the frequency it was built to run at. The binary stars were behind it, both of them, old and amber, the doubled light making the ship look as though it had been set against something permanent and unhurried. He had the completion report on his slate and the maintenance schedule in the shared technical file, and Rake's contact information for any follow-up questions. He had a draft outline for the technical paper on resonance bridge repair under crystalline stress propagation. He had the memory of an observation room and doubled amber light and tea that had gone cold. He also had in his work log one additional note. Day 10. All 7 coupling arrays corrected and confirmed. Ship is running at design specification. Resonance signature nominal across all drive bay sections. No further issues identified. Recommend follow-up review per the attached maintenance schedule. Personal note, arrive a day early. He looked at it. Then he looked out at the asterisk sovereign meridian and the doubled amber light and the particular quality of something that was running correctly and knew it. He closed the work log. 8 months was not very long at all.